All right, A-Pushians, here we go with the second to last note set of the entire year, looking at the 1960s into the early 1970s. The turbulent 60s here covers two really, really big deal presidencies and a pretty rockin' time in American history, as it were. If you think back to before break, the last thing that you covered kind of contextually, you looked at the civil rights movement of the 1960s, talked about the I Have a Dream speech, and watched the video that sort of covered that span. And you also looked a little bit at comparing John F. Kennedy and then Johnson, two big presidencies of the 1960s. So if you take a look at this note set here, 1963 to 73, this 1963, what that does is that picks us up exactly with Kennedy dying. Kennedy is assassinated in November of 1963, and it's going to take us through, this year will be 74, it's basically going to take us through the end of Nixon's presidency. He's going to resign, step down in 1974. So that's where we're headed. So we're going to start off by talking just a little bit about Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson. In the web quest that you guys were working on before break, you looked a little bit at some of his speeches and a few things. Johnson is one of those really important kind of pivotal presidents. He's also very controversial. There's a lot of people still today who don't like him, largely because of the Vietnam War. But he's a major impact on kind of American economy and government. Here we go. Johnson's kind of an interesting character. He's probably one of our only presidents that you can really say was actually born into poverty. He was born the son of a sharecropper in like southern Texas, so he grew up very poor, sort of scrambling as like kind of a bootstrap type, backstory. And he came of age, like he became a politician in his young life during the New Deal. And he's sort of very dedicated to that kind of New Deal style of liberalism. That's a really important connection to make. Very common 20th century comparison is kind of LBJ and FDR, and the New Deal versus Johnson's program that we'll talk about in just a second here. But Johnson, unlike FDR, was very kind of like rude and crude and uncouth. What you're seeing in this picture here is him giving a politician, I believe, what was called the Johnson treatment. He was kind of tall. He would like loom in people's faces and like talk real loud and kind of get up in their space and use that to intimidate. He was a really skilled politician. He had been in the Senate for a long time before he became vice president and then president when Kennedy was assassinated. And he was just really good at sort of making deals and brokering deals and relationships and things of that nature. So very successful in that way. He serves out the rest of Kennedy's term. So Kennedy's assassinated in November of 64, Kennedy's assassinated in November of 63, and then a year later in November of 64 would have been Kennedy's reelection, but instead what we get is Johnson running. Johnson, as you may remember from some of the stuff you guys looked at last week, is actually very pro-civil rights laws. He uses Kennedy's death, uses Kennedy's sort of martyr status to push forward the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Huge deal piece of legislation that basically ended Jim Crow in the United States. And so he's running on this platform of, kind of continuing Kennedy's legacy and this New Deal liberalism. And his opposite, the Republicans are going to go with an interesting character, and this is a guy named Barry Goldwater. Goldwater is significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, he's from Arizona, so he's sort of our first politician to really represent that kind of like southwestern, like Sun Belt area that we mentioned in some previous note sets. Goldwater is also one of the politicians that I talked about when we were talking about the rise of the new conservative movement, people who looked at Eisenhower in the 1950s and said, well, this guy isn't really a conservative, and we're trying to kind of like redefine the Republican Party. Goldwater also, however, was very known for being like super anti-communist and very aggressively so in a like, let's just kind of drop the bomb on them all type way. And a lot of people accurately saw him as like dangerous, that he was kind of a madman and that he was somebody who needed to be controlled or who would have to be controlled in order to make things work. The Johnson campaign comes with a very famous commercial with some very famous imagery, which I'm going to splice in here so that you guys can take a look at it. It's called the Daisy Girl ad, and it only ran once. I think it ran during, I don't know, some sort of primetime event, and it was so sort of controversial when it ran that they pulled it, but it made a very big impression, and it still gets referenced a lot in modern media, so it's a good thing to recognize. So you can take a look at this Daisy Girl campaign commercial ad and think a little bit about what that has to say about Johnson, or excuse me, about Goldwater. Okay, So that commercial, as you can see, is very dramatic, very melodramatic, right? We must either love each other or we must die. But it carries this basic message from Johnson that was very effective, which is that, like, this, you know, if you elect Goldwater, like, we're just all going to die, right? We're all going to head into some sort of nuclear war and hit crisis. And if you recall, under Kennedy's presidency, we'd had the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest our country ever really came to direct war with the Soviet Union. So that was a really big deal. That was 1962. We're still kind of feeling that a little. And so Goldwater kind of crashes and burns with it. So take a look at this 1964 electoral map. The thing that obviously strikes immediately is that Johnson wins pretty overwhelmingly, but the thing that should draw your attention here, that's very interesting, is what's going on in the South here. So this is sort of our deep South, right, kind of the heart of the Confederacy. Johnson wins Texas, he's from Texas, and some other southern states as well, but this, like, band right here really gives us 1964 as the end of something that we've kind of been tracing since the Civil War, and that's this whole idea of the Solid South. Remember that all the way since the end of Reconstruction, so since white Southerners regained control of their governments after the Civil War, right, starting in about 1880, what we have seen is a consistent vote from this block of former Confederate states for the South for basically 100 years, right? So we have 1880, 1884, 88, 92, 96, 1900, 1904, etc. These years right in here, this is Teddy Roosevelt, right? That's the big kind of takeover there. Apologize, that's Woodrow Wilson, which is the big Democratic takeover that you're looking at there. 1920, 24, 28, 1932. This is FDR's first run. 36 and 40, those are all the FDR elections, 44 as well. And then 48, right, this is where you start to see Truman and some of his civil rights Dixiecrat policies kind of chipping away with that third party down there that was Strom Thurmond. 52, 56, 60, this is where we've been kind of in the last few weeks talking about the wavering of the Solid South. And here, finally in 1964, we've got that flip. So if you looked at politics after we talked about the Civil War and who voted for which party, and you kind of thought to yourself, like, well, when did that flip, right? When did that change? Here is your answer. It starts to change a little in the 1940s with, like, Roosevelt and then Truman, but it really doesn't fully coalesce, that flip in the way that, like, deep southern states vote until 1964. We're going to see some wavering back and forth when we hit, like, Carter in the 1970s, etc. But this is really, truly, 1964 is a good year to peg as the end of this tradition or this trend of former Confederate states voting a solid, reliable Democratic bloc. It's a big deal. So what we have to do then, or what we have to understand then, is kind of that the politics as of 1964 have taken a shift. And this is sort of who we're looking at when we're defining liberal and conservative post-1964. So when we look at liberals, kind of LBJ liberals, we're looking at people who are anti-communist in general, especially abroad. So that's the Vietnam War right in there. But in general, we're in favor of big government, as we will see when we talk about the Great Society in just a sec. We're also going to see the liberals tend to be in favor of social programs, social welfare programs, those kinds of things. This is really when we start to see this idea of conservative as very associated with not only, like, small government and states' rights, which was a big Barry Goldwater thing, and which we'll see growing throughout the 70s and the 80s, but also this idea of socially conservative. That's not something, like, if you trace politics back and you look at the 1840s and what was considered liberal and conservative, the idea of a social conservative platform is not really something that we would have seen before. The 60s is really the first time that starts to come about. It's going to strengthen throughout the 70s and then kind of bring in the big wave of neoconservatism in the 1980s under Reagan. So liberal versus conservative. One of the things that's kind of driving this split between liberal and conservative are the courts, which starting in the 1950s and very much continuing in the 60s have become very activist. If you take a look at this list of Warren Court cases, Warren Court was the era of the court from 53 to 69. These should all look pretty familiar to you. They're all cases that come up in civics, if you cast your mind back to last year. And they're all cases that, for the most part, a lot of these are sort of rights of the accused. So you have protection from search and seizure. Like, you have a right to a lawyer. You have the right to be informed of your rights. That's the Miranda case, right? You might remember maybe Tinker versus Des Moines. That's the one about the students and their right to freedom of speech at school. They were wearing the armbands to protest the Vietnam War. So what we're seeing in general in the 1960s, and an important phrase to know, is what people who don't like it call judicial activism, and that is the courts taking a much more like, I guess you could say, liberal lean at the Constitution and interpreting the Constitution in a way that's more consonant with like modern society, but that doesn't, go along with the kind of strict constructionalist view that a lot of people who are more conservative take. So the Warren Court is one of the things that's driving the kind of shift in what we call liberal and conservative. It's a pretty important era of the court. There are also just a couple of very kind of key wedge issues or splinter issues that are going to cause the rise of that neoconservative movement. Three that I've got here are going to be kind of three key issues for the social conservative movement as it grows. One of them, as we've kind of been hinting at, is definitely civil rights. So Brown versus Board pushes a lot of people into kind of what they would consider socially conservative or pro-segregation, anti-civil rights type stance. The other two that are worth noting, in 1962, there's a really big deal Supreme Court ruling called Engel versus Vital, which basically outlaws prayer in public school. So people who are, sort of strongly religious, strongly Christian religious, and feel that the Engel versus Vital sort of goes against that. This is going to be one of the things that will drive them out of the Democratic Party and into a more socially conservative stance. And the same thing with Griswold versus Connecticut is one of the first court cases that really deals with like birth control. The birth control pill, the hormonal birth control pill, was introduced in 1960 or 1961. And Griswold versus Connecticut essentially decrees that you can't be refused the right to contraception, although obviously that's still an issue that draws a lot of criticism and a lot of controversy today. So those three issues, sort of contraceptions, what's eventually going to become the debate over abortion, school prayer, and then like segregation and civil rights. Those are three things that are really going to shape kind of the bedrock of that like social conservative backlash. Meanwhile, however, LBJ is going to go full bore liberal. He's going to introduce in 1964, while he's running for president, a slate of programs that he calls the Great Society. So Great Society is the term for Johnson's social programs in the same way that the New Deal was the term for, LBJ's social programs, and John F. Kennedy had his New Frontier that didn't really get going. Teddy Roosevelt had his Square Deal. So this is just another in a series of like names, terms that go along with the Great Society here. Johnson talked about the Great Society as a war on poverty and really wanted to end generational poverty in a way by creating a whole slate of programs run by and funded by the federal government that would provide like ladders out of poverty or provide what we call today a social safety net, right? A place to catch people so that they don't kind of fall through the cracks. The foundational principle that I have down here at the bottom is sort of a good way to generally understand the Great Society, which is the idea that the best way to deal with poverty, it's not just to give people more money, which is kind of more what the New Deal did with a lot of its jobs programs, but actually to help them like better themselves. So provide like educational opportunities, provide opportunities for people to be exposed to art and literature, to have job training, to develop their communities from within, those kinds of things. So the Great Society is going to wind up being a major slate of economic programs. Only real other comparable set of programs in terms of how many there are and how widespread and impactful they are is the New Deal. And the sort of centerpiece of it is the passage of this, the Economic Opportunities Act, which creates the OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity. So this is what creates the federal food stamp program, basically, that we still have today. Many states had their own food stamp programs before this. This is when the federal food stamp program goes into effect. Upward Bound and Head Start are both educational programs. Upward Bound provides free or subsidized preschool for students who can't pay for preschool on their own. And then, I got those flipped. Head Start is free or subsidized preschool. And then Upward Bound is a college program that's available on most college campuses. Some of you guys might wind up finding yourself in this. If you're the first student in your family to go to college, so if you're a first generation college student, you can usually hook up with Upward Bound. They do a lot of, they work with like families on FAFSA, and they do summer initiation programs, and they work to help students who don't have a lot of experience with kind of the world of college to kind of stay in and stay connected to college itself. It's also going to take Social Security, which originally was very focused around just the elderly, and expanded out a lot to include a lot more of the disability benefits that it includes today, and then also the medical health insurance benefits, which we'll see in a sec. So that's the OEO. Again, that sort of safety net is very much what we're looking at there. Another big tent pole of the Great Society programs are those major pieces of civil rights legislation that hopefully you should have gotten last week, but if you didn't, they are here and they are very, 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 very important. If I was going to make a list of like the top 10 most important pieces of legislation in American history and on the AP exam, the Civil Rights Act of 64 would definitely be up there. Maybe it might not be number one, but it's certainly close if it's not. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 ends de jure segregation in the United States. It ends segregation by law. It is no longer legal to segregate in any public place. If you've got a business that's open to the public, you can't segregate based on race. It also creates the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission to monitor and make sure that people are not discriminating in hiring. The Voting Rights Act of 65 makes it illegal to discriminate based on race in voting. It creates a commission that was around for a long time, up until just a couple of years ago, that monitors states that have a history of voting discrimination and ensures that they're not passing laws that don't say, Black people can vote, but that create kind of other barriers. So that's what the Voting Rights Act is about. Another thing that the Great Society does that's kind of along the civil rights line, it doesn't really fit neatly anywhere else, is that it redoes our immigration. So the last time that we redid our immigration, as you might recall, if you cast your mind back to the beginning of last unit, was in the 1920s when we got all freaked out about like radicalism and communism. It was like the first Red Scare, and we had this whole national origin system. So in 1965, we redo that to be a little less racist, although still somewhat institutionally racist. And this is basically still the system that we have today. It's been overhauled in some sort of tweaks in some ways at various points in time since then, especially in the 1980s. But basically, the system that's created in 1965 is the one we still have today. No national origins quota or anything like that. Other aspects of the Great Society. So the Great Society also focuses a lot on urban and inner city issues. This is when we have the creation of a new cabinet. There's actually going to be two new cabinet departments created under Great Society. One of them is HUD, Housing and Urban Development, which runs housing projects. So if you ever hear people talk about living in the projects or whatnot, that's what they're talking about, these federally subsidized housing programs, among a variety of other things. And then also, and this is like a little late, as you might notice if you take a look here, but it's a pretty important piece of legislation. It's called the Fair Housing Act, or sometimes the Civil Rights Act of 68. And what this does is fight a practice called redlining that we're going to talk a little bit more about later on in this minute. The Great Society also includes a lot of like consumer protection type stuff, health, consumer protection. Potentially are arguably the biggest and most long-term impactful programs to come out of the Great Society are Medicare and Medicaid, which are established by the passage of a pair of acts in 64 and 65. Medicare and Medicaid provide health insurance. In the case of, I always get these split. Let me think about this. So Medicare is the one that goes along with Social Security and is passed to, so anybody who's eligible for Social Security basically is eligible for Medicare. It just functions like regular health insurance, but it's provided by the government, not by your employer or someone else. Medicaid, on the other hand, is subsidized health insurance basically for people who fall below the poverty line or who qualify in some other way through disability, etc. And that's handled a little bit differently, and this is what a lot of the current political fight is about, but it's basically that the states and the federal government sort of split the funding for that. So Medicare and Medicaid health insurance programs put into place by the Great Society in the 1960s. This is also when we see the government pass its first, what we might consider, environmental regulation acts. They pass a series of laws. It's like the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act. They do exactly what they sound like. We're not quite to the creation of the EPA yet, the Environmental Protection Agency. That's going to come under Nixon in 1970. But this is the first time that we see the government taking any sort of action in that direction. If you guys have taken APES and you read or talked about Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, that book is published in like 1962, kind of right before all of this, and it has a big impact on the rising environmental movement and the passage of these two laws. We also passed this Fair Packaging and Labeling Act, which is like when you look at a piece of food or whatnot, and it's got a package and it tells you how many calories are in it, or what the percent daily dosage of sodium, or the label on cigarettes that says, hey, these might be hazardous to your health. A lot of those things are come about because of the requirements of this Fair Packaging and Labeling Act. Highway Safety Act is what starts to initiate things like seatbelt laws. Prior to this, in 1965, seatbelts used to be like an option that you didn't have, so you could buy your car like without seatbelts. It was an add-on, like a sunroof before this. The Highway Safety Act also changes how like roads are constructed, so it makes it so that if you're going to paint whatever lane markers on roads, that you have to paint them like fluorescent or reflective so that people can see them at night too. And if you're going to put a sign by the road, it has to be made from breakaway material, those kinds of things. So a lot of just kind of general consumer and health protection type stuff associated with the Great Society. Lots of arts programs. This is when the federal government starts to fund a lot of the major arts programs that it funds today. So the National Endowment for the Humanities that we have down here, National Endowment for the Arts. This is when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting is created, which funds and runs NPR, National Public Radio, and then also PBS. A lot of, if you are a public library or public museum, then you probably get at least some of your federal funding through the Institute of Museum and Library Services. That's all part of the Great Society. And the idea here is that you're creating public sources of knowledge and art that anyone can access regardless of their income level. So like the Smithsonian museums are a great example, or PBS. Anybody can get PBS. You don't have to pay for cable. You just have to have some TV that you can plug in an antenna, and your kids can benefit from Sesame Street, or you can walk into the Smithsonian, or you can use your public library, right? Those kinds of things. So overall, in general, and this is hotly debated, so whether this is what we're going to go with here, in general, the Great Society is generally considered to be effective. The poverty rate does go down. Now, people who don't like the Great Society, as we'll talk about in a sec, just say that, well, the country was doing well overall anyway, and so the poverty rate was going to automatically go down. But this is a fact. Like the poverty rate does go down in the years of the Great Society pretty considerably. The problem with the Great Society programs, if you look at all this, it sounds great, right? We're funding the arts, we're funding preschool, we're funding healthcare, like you go to college, yay! But all of that costs a lot of money, right? Medicare and Medicaid in particular. And so that the question is, how do we pay for it? And the answer, unfortunately, is that there's not really a great answer. Where there's like some tax cuts to stimulate growth, and we're sort of relying on just general increase in GDP and GNP, which we've had up until this point pretty solidly. The problem is going to come for the Great Society when something comes along that's going to cost a lot of money and take a lot of our energy and effort away, and that of course is the Vietnam War. So the Great Society and the Vietnam War are going to kind of fight for funding, and the Great Society is going to lose. A lot of these programs that we're talking about are much like lower funded or underfunded than they were originally intended to be, because that money gets sort of siphoned off to pay for the Vietnam War. One last word on the Great Society before we leave it to talk about Vietnam. If you were like kind of listening to this section and looking at this list of programs and thinking like, gee, that sounds kind of familiar, it sounds an awful lot like the types of programs that we're fighting over in like the current budget today in 2017, you would be correct. If you are, or if you know somebody who considers themselves a very strong conservative, so they are a fiscal conservative, they want to see our government really shrink its budget, that's sort of a Paul Ryan type thing. The Great Society programs are like the on-ramp to the apocalypse. Like this is, if you are again a kind of a hardline fiscal conservative, this is where the federal government went wrong, right? This is where we started to do too much, we took on too much. The New Deal was one thing, but this is like too far, and we've kind of been getting too big and overstepping our bounds ever since. And all of these things that are in here, they're great, but they should be handled by private industry, or they should be handled by the states, right, if you're going to put them in the hands of government. So from the 1960s through today, one of the big things that conservatives and liberals fight over are these Great Society programs. People who are liberal tend to really like these, right? If you're a liberal person, you probably listen to that and we're like, wow, it sounds really great. Like those are all things that I like and I'm happy that the government is doing. But people who are conservative, again, see them as a big overstepping of like the government's role in society. And so that's why a lot of them are still kind of contentious today, although very ingrained in our society. So that's a pretty important point. The Great Society is like the height of 20th century liberalism. This is as big and as bold as we're going to go, and we're going to spend the rest of the 20th century sort of fighting over how to play all of this stuff out. So if you are a person especially who is pretty liberal and you just listen to that, you might be coming out of this thinking that Johnson is pretty awesome and that you are a big fan. However, a lot of people who are on the more liberal side of the spectrum really don't like Johnson and don't have a very good memory of him. If you look at him, he is ranked kind of middling low usually on those presidents lists, and a lot of that is because of Vietnam. It's going to come to dominate his entire presidency. It's going to sort of suck us into what was for a long time America's longest war, although it's not anymore. And so we're going to take a little bit of time here to talk just a bit about the Vietnam War and kind of what's generally going on in there. Your textbook definitely illuminates some of this in some more depth. So just a reminder of what's going on here. So Vietnam has been an area where the United States has had some involvement since about the 1950s. So recall that this whole area used to be called French Indochina, right? Everything that was all Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, that was all a French colony, French Indochina. And they've been fighting for their independence since the 1930s. And then in the 1950s, 1954 to be exact, the French withdraw. This is post-World War II. And the French Indochina is dissolved. We create Laos, Cambodia, and then North and South Vietnam. Some geographic stuff that you need to know. North Vietnam, which is communist, sorry. The capital of North Vietnam is the city of Hanoi. That's a good one to remember, recognize it's Hanoi. South Vietnam, the capital of South Vietnam, is a city that was called Saigon, Saigon, and that's also a pretty important city to know. There's going to be a lot of fighting over Saigon, and when it eventually falls, it's going to be a fairly big deal. The dividing line, the dividing area between the two, North and South Vietnam, is called the DMZ, or the Demilitarized Zone. There's also one of those in Korea, so that's just a good, quick geographic stuff to know. The last time that we checked in, or that you looked at Vietnam, it was 1963. That's the last year of the Kennedy presidency. And the situation in 1963 was basically that the guy who had been president of South Vietnam, this is the U.S. allied, non-communist South Vietnam for 10 years, this guy named Ngo Diem. And Diem was very controversial. If you talk to 10 Vietnamese people about Diem, you will generally get 10 different points of view. And part of the issue was that Vietnam was not only divided north and south, like if you consider this a civil war, that's not just communist, non-communist, there's also a lot of religious civil war essentially going on. Diem himself is Catholic, and the significant Buddhist minority in Vietnam felt fairly accurately that they were being oppressed and discriminated against by the Diem regime. There's a lot of stuff that we'll get into, that your textbook gets into a little bit more, but in 1963 there's essentially an internal uprising within South Vietnam going on that's based on this sort of Catholic versus Buddhist, Christian versus Buddhist divide in the country. And it's really getting quite dramatic. This picture that's right here is a very famous and sort of widespread, world-known picture of a Buddhist monk in the summer of 1963 setting himself on fire as a ritualistic suicide to draw attention, to draw the eyes of the world to this internal problem, this oppression of the Buddhist Vietnamese citizens. And so you've got this sort of internal tension going on. Diem is doesn't really have like I would say the confidence of the people of South Vietnam. They're supposed to be holding elections to reunify Vietnam in 63. He doesn't want to hold them because they're pretty sure that the communists are going to win. The communist leader of North Vietnam, by the way, meanwhile, is a guy named Ho Chi Minh up here. That's a good name to recognize as well. And so in 1963, November of 63, just a few weeks before Kennedy himself is assassinated, Diem is going to be assassinated as well. There's a coup. He's overthrown. He's assassinated. The U.S. CIA is involved in the overthrow, if not directly in the assassination itself. And that sets the stage for this sort of instability in South Vietnam. So Kennedy assassinated November 63. Johnson takes over. South Vietnam is in turmoil. They go through a series of military leaders. They're not really able to find anybody who can hold on to power as the president of South Vietnam. So we've got a bunch of ships stationed in the area, right? We're hanging out here in the South China Sea where it makes sense for us to be. We're also where we maybe potentially shouldn't be. We're up here in the Gulf of Tonkin, which is this water off of North Vietnam. There's several U.S. ships up there. In August of 1964, there is an incident that we usually refer to as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. One or two U.S. ships, depending on what you believe in the report, are potentially fired on by North Vietnamese torpedoes. The ships, there's a lot of conflicting information about this, but what you need to know is that Johnson goes to Congress in August of 1964 and says that two of our ships have been attacked by North Vietnamese troops, that they've sent out a ship to gunfight with us, and I think that some torpedoes had been fired from the mainland, if I'm not mistaken. That's also alleged. Johnson wants Congress to declare war, right? Which, remember, is sort of the way that this type of thing usually goes. But Congress is not going to declare war. Instead, what they're going to do is pass a law called the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This is super, super important. This is summer of 1964. And what the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution does is it grants the president, aka Johnson, the power to retaliate for strikes against the United States, including, and this is particularly important, the use of ground troops, which hadn't previously been authorized, and without any sort of like check or chain on it. The Gulf of Tonkin Resolution doesn't include like time limits or further mandates on the part of like what the president has to do to keep this open. It essentially creates an open, like a blank check for the president to use to wage war in South Vietnam in everything but name. So the Vietnam War, like the Korean War, is not an actual war, right? Congress never declares war. In Korea, we were fighting with the United Nations troops, right? At least, so that had some legitimacy there. But here, it's basically just a military action waged largely by the executive branch of the United States, and that's one reason, a major reason, why it's going to wind up being so controversial and why we're going to see such a strong opposition to it. So the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, sometimes called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution, passed in August of 1964. What that does basically is that starts the Vietnam War. So if you're looking at anything in an American history textbook and it's talking about the Vietnam War, it's going to say that it starts in August of 1964, and that's with the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. We've been kind of tracing our containment policy rather than taking a look at what each of the presidents does. So we've looked at Truman and his sort of traditional style containment, Eisenhower's new look, Kennedy's flexible response. Here is LBJ, and the big reason that we get involved in Vietnam is this idea of the domino theory. This is the idea that South Vietnam is the kind of crucial lead domino in this, tremulous situation in Southeast Asia, and that if we let South Vietnam fall, if South Vietnam becomes communist, that it's going to take all of these other countries with it. Then Cambodia will go, and Laos, and Thailand, and all the way over to India and Pakistan, right? That it's going to just sort of take out the whole region. So, I don't know if you're right up there, right? So Johnson is strongly convinced, as are a lot of people in his presidency, that like we have to hold the line here, right? If we let South Vietnam fall, then we're basically allowing the war to just kind of go forward. The actual military operation is called Operation Rolling Thunder. We send 50,000 troops initially. That's going to escalate up quite considerably over the next few years. And one of the issues, there's a lot of them, one of the issues in the Vietnam War is basically that there's no really super clear enemy for us to fight because we haven't really declared war, and because at this point the North Vietnamese haven't invaded anything. We are technically fighting the North Vietnamese army, but not directly, at least not at first. There's going to be various points in the war where we will engage directly with the North Vietnamese army, but again, they haven't crossed any lines or invaded directly, so that's not exactly our chief enemy, at least not at first. So what we're going to find ourselves mostly battling are kind of an internal insurgency that we're going to call the Viet Cong, VC or Charlie. I use Victor Charlie sometimes, and that's our term for communists who are in South Vietnam, either are South Vietnamese themselves or are just living in South Vietnam, and who are kind of in hiding, right? It's sort of the farmer by day, VC by night, kind of underground agent is what we're particularly concerned with. That's a really hard war to fight, right? When you're talking about kind of a war that's against kind of people who are embedded in society. How do you know when you've won? How do you know when you've cleared everything out? How do you tell someone who's a Viet Cong from someone who's a normal South Vietnamese person loyal to the government and friendly to the United States? The answer to that is you can't, or you don't. The country of Vietnam itself is gorgeous, but it's also very tropical and very jungly, and unlike really any place that the U.S. has ever fought before, probably the only comparable area that the United States has ever fought really is maybe some of the island hopping battles during the Pacific, so some of Guadalcanal and those. But otherwise, we've just never really experienced anything like this, especially not for this length of time. It's very humid, long, tall, razor grass. It rains very heavily for half the year. A major crop in Vietnam is rice, right? So there's a lot of flooded land for rice paddies. Soldiers called Vietnam the Green Hell, and talked about the land as almost like a separate enemy in and of itself. It was very much sort of dominated the mind and the fighting tactics of the war. It takes us a little while to really get used to, if we could ever really be said to be getting used to the fighting style that's necessitated here. The fighting style itself, again, is different. This is not like open land fighting. You line your troops up, we line our troops up, we shoot at each other. This is not even a ground war with, tanks and, bombs dropping like we're used to from maybe, say, World War II. What we've got is we've got an enemy who has basically been fighting in many cases for their whole life against us, against the French before us, and are very used to this just sort of like long game. All that they need to do is, annoy us enough to leave. They're very good at using the jungle and using the countryside to accomplish this. There's large swaths of like tunnel complexes underneath the jungle. So an American, troop of soldiers could be out walking through the jungle, on raids or on patrol. It would be very easy for VC to sort of spring up from a tunnel, make a sneak attack, kill whoever they could kill, and then just sort of melt back into another tunnel, maybe collapse that entrance if it's been found. The jungle itself also becomes very heavily booby trapped. There was a strong tendency to set up these stake traps. They're called Punjai stake traps, right? And what they would be generally is like pit dug and then like sharpened bamboo sticks, usually placed at the bottom. And so if you're marching along and you kind of not looking where you're going, it would look just like you were stepping on solid ground until you stepped into it and impaled your foot, your ankle, your calf, etc., on the sticks below. The United States developed a series of new weapons to try to combat the kind of jungly atmosphere. One of them, it's kind of a weapon, kind of not a weapon, is Agent Orange. This is a deforestation agent. It kills trees, kills foliage. So we would spray it from planes overhead, or you could be like a soldier would maybe wear a tank of it on their back and spray it through a hose sometimes too. And it would kill the surrounding countryside, allowing us easier sort of view to bomb or to see kind of what's going on in the undergrowth. The problem with Agent Orange that we weren't super aware of at the time is that it turns out to be very heavily carcinogenic, very cancer causing. It's going to cause a lot of problems for the local Vietnamese population and for American soldiers who come into contact with it. We also use a tremendous amount of napalm in Vietnam. Napalm was developed in the last year or two of World War II. So we use it against Germany and Japan in the last couple of years of World War II, but it's especially used here in Vietnam. It's very effective in wet conditions. What napalm is, it's like if you can imagine a bomb that's packed with like a jelly substance, almost got the same consistency as like petroleum jelly or Vaseline, except it's made of an accelerant. So when the bomb drops, the bomb explodes, whatever it lands on, and it also flings out these globs that you can see in this picture here, that almost like the firework streamers. It flings out these globs of this flaming like Vaseline jelly that land on whatever they land on, and they stick to it. So it's not just that that it can catch something on fire momentarily, but it sticks and it burns, and it's got a much more effective rate. The problem, of course, is that it doesn't just stick to buildings or whatever you're trying to explode, it also sticks to people. And it's going to cause some really, really horrific burns. We'll see. Vietnam War also going to be really dominated by helicopters. This kind of makes sense when you think about it. We've had helicopters for a while again since World War II, but this is one of the first wars where we really see them used as a big part of the fighting fleet, because helicopters can take off and land vertically. That's really important in a jungle. You don't have a lot of room for an airstrip necessarily. They also can hover, which is something that planes don't really accomplish. So that's a big deal. Meanwhile, back at home, the Vietnam War eventually is going to gather the largest anti-war movement in all of American history. Every single war America has ever fought has had some sort of anti-war movement. Even the ones that we think of as like quote-unquote good wars, like World War II, there's always some people who are against the war. But what's going to be different about Vietnam is by the time it's over, it's well over half of the United States is opposed to the war by the time that we actually pull out in the 1970s. But it doesn't start out that way. So in 1964, if whatever, Gulf of Tonkin Resolution happens, first troops are sent overseas, and if you just walked around and asked, 10 random people in 1964 what they thought about the war in Vietnam, most people didn't really know a lot about it, or just generally thought, well, communism bad, so, sure, we support what we're doing. But there's a couple of things that are going to come to kind of drive this anti-war movement and that are going to make it a lot more large scale than some of the other anti-war movements that we've seen. One of them is going to be the draft. So we've had drafts in every major war since the Civil War, right? Both sides drafted in the Civil War, and then the draft went away. We drafted in World War I, the draft went away, drafted in World War II, and the draft that was put in place in World War II, that's like Selective Service Act of 1940, that's still the one that's in place here. and so this isn't, again, it's not new. We fought wars with drafts before, but what is new, and what's going to impact the perception of the draft is that a lot more people are now middle class. A lot of more kids are middle class, and so they qualify for a specific kind of draft exemption that's never been quite as big of a deal before. And that is the fact that if you are in college, if you're in school, then you can have your draft deferred, excuse me, not exempted, but deferred until you get out of school. And so if you think about that essentially by paying for college, you can like pay to keep your kid out of the war, out of the army. That's the kind of thing that's really going to drive some of the anti-war movement. So you get here, yeah. So you get this whole sort of like we can end war, poor man's fight type thing, or type response, I guess you could say, from a lot of people who don't like the draft and think that it's generally unfair. The the draft itself ensures that the army in Vietnam is like a skewed representation of society. So if you look, for example, at the African American population in the United States, it's always been, I think, 11 or 12% of the American population identifies as African American or Black. And then if you look at the Army during Vietnam, it's like a little under 30% of the Army is African American or Black. The same holds true for sort of other underprivileged classes. So you've got an Army that skews overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly minority, because, again, there's this growing middle class of people who, kind of had their kids grow up in the suburbs. They were baby boomers, and they're able to sort of stay at home and look at this divide and see it as deeply unfair. And that's a lot of what's going to drive the early parts of the anti-Vietnam War movement, which are going to be largely youth-driven. Other things that are going to drive the Vietnam anti-war movement, this question that we already talked about, which is that there's not a very clear end point or enemy in Vietnam. We know generally that we don't like communists, but like, when do we get to leave? What is the end goal? That's all a little bit more vague than I think people would like it to be. And then the other thing, and this is really, really not to be underestimated, that Vietnam is the first war that we have ever fought where we have televisions and where we can see the war a little more directly. If you think back to the last time that we fought a big war, right, World War II, that was in the 1940s. And so the only way that people could see what was actually going on, like a visual, movie, right, or video captured image of the war, was going to be through newsreels that were mostly done by the government and were shown before movies. Those are very heavily controlled and very heavily edited. That what goes on the CBS Evening News or what goes on ABC News or NBC News, that's edited too, but it's much less edited. So one of the things that's true about the Vietnam War is that people tend to perceive it as being like way worse than other wars, that it's, we're doing these awful things and these awful things are being done to our soldiers, and it's worse, it's more atrocious, there's these more atrocities. And that's not really true. A war is always awful, and we always do atrocities, and we always have atrocities done to us. We've just never had to see them, at 6 p.m. while we're sitting in our living rooms eating a plate of spaghetti before, right? It's just never been quite that present. And so this modern media really drives our feelings about the Vietnam War in a way that we haven't seen before. And I think it's one reason why I don't think personally that we will ever fight another war that has as universal support as, say, World War II did, because we have so much of a stronger sense of what war actually looks like today. So one of the big faces of media in the 1960s is this guy right here. This is Walter Cronkite, who was the host of the CBS Evening News for ever and was sort of very trusted. And at the end, on Sundays, at the end of the CBS Evening News, that Cronkite would run this whole list. They would scroll a list of all of the young men who had died in Vietnam that week and all of their ages. And so it's just sort of keeping these kinds of atrocities front and center. You were seeing fights, you were seeing people dying, you were seeing people executed on live TV. This is a very famous shot of a Saigon police chief executing a suspected VC. You're seeing the reality, and this is a really famous Pulitzer Prize winning photo of a young girl whose clothes have been burned off of her by napalm, deep, skin damage. So this is all, again, it's not like nobody ever got burned or died in World War II. We just didn't see it. It wasn't that present in the way that the Vietnam War is. So this sort of television war aspect of Vietnam really drives a lot of the anti-war movement in a way that we've never really seen before. So next up, in our discussion of the turbulent 1960s is a discussion of something that comes directly out of what we just finished talking about, aka the draft and the Vietnam War and sort of general agitation against the Vietnam War. And that's the rise of what we're going to call the counterculture, or what's sometimes kind of generally referred to as the hippie movement in the late 1960s, mid and late 1960s. So there's a couple different strands to the counterculture that you need to be aware of. One of them, and a term that you need to know, a good sort of vocab term to make sure you write down or highlight or circle, is this idea of the New Left. And the New Left was a liberal, political, youth-driven movement in the 1960s that looked at politicians like Johnson in the Democratic Party and said, you know what, you say you're liberal, but that's not the kind of liberalism that I believe or that I think we should be standing for, that your immoral policies like the Vietnam War, that you're too focused on, fighting communism abroad and not focused enough on, these social programs here at home, that you're, sort of not paying enough attention to racial, social issues, gender issues, those kinds of things. And so a lot of the struggle in the Democratic Party in the 1960s is not dissimilar from what's going on in the Democratic Party currently. And that's a struggle between kind of like the mainstream liberal Democratic Party, Johnson and sort of his people, and then this young new youth, what we might call progressive, right, today, sort of subset that's going to be much more anti-Vietnam War, pro sort of social reform, extreme sort of radical social reform. And so that internal struggle within the Democratic Party is going to eventually divide them by the late 1960s, as we'll see. The big thing, of course, that drives the New Left, the New Left movement, is the anti-war movement, as we kind of talked about a little bit in the last segment. So, there's a bunch of different reasons why people might have been anti-war, just in general opposed to our involvement. There were certainly some people who didn't see anything wrong with communism and thought that we shouldn't, that communism was good or was a valid choice, that we shouldn't be involved in it. But the anti-war movement is very, very, very strongly linked to college campuses. That's really where it starts out and where it grows extensively. In April 1965, right, the war has been going on for about a year. So when we first start to see some of our larger scale demonstrations, 25,000 people, that's a lot of people, but it's not nearly as many as we're going to see by the end of the war, but that's a solid amount of people. And that's going to be led by two groups. SNCC, who hopefully you remember from the discussion of the civil rights. This is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee that was a Black civil rights group. They had run Freedom Summer in Mississippi and the Freedom Rides. They were formed kind of in the wake of the Greensboro sit-ins. And then this other group here, SDS, which is new to us, but which we're going to take a second to talk about here right now. And that's called Students for a Democratic Society. So SDS, or Students for a Democratic Society, is the main New Left kind of counterculture organization that you need to know a little bit about. It's founded, like the slide notes, at University of Michigan in '62, but it really catches fire with the anti-war movement. They focus a lot on the draft as a sort of social and moral issue. They focus on the war in general. They focus also kind of not just Vietnam War related, but on sort of students' rights in particular, so students' rights to freedom of speech on campus. They tended to do things like protest when, popular kind of left-leaning professors would be fired, and you'd see protests from SDS. They become particularly associated with building takeovers. So at my alma mater, where I went, UC Santa Barbara, it was 1971, I believe, there was a building takeover of the dean's office. A bunch of students rushed into the building, barricaded the doors, chained themselves to furniture outside the dean's office, and held a building takeover until the administration agreed to meet with them and listen to their demands. So that's a fairly typical kind of tactical swing for SDS, for Students for a Democratic Society. Another more radical group are the Yippies, headed by this guy here in his famous American flag shirt. That's Abbie Hoffman. And they tended to be more stunty. They're very much on the extreme radical end of the counterculture or the New Left. They liked to do big media attention gathering stunts. The most famous one is that they run a pig for president in 1968 against Johnson as a candidate on the Democratic Party ticket. They hold a big rally outside in Chicago, outside where the convention is happening. When the police eventually show up to arrest Pegasus and also several high-profile members of the Yippies, it winds up going to trial. There's a whole ordinance in Chicago about not having a pig in the city, and it becomes kind of like a media circus, and that's on purpose. That's sort of what they're looking for. They like to sort of draw attention. So they're the Yippies, who got SDS, right, or some of the more organized, quote-unquote, aspects of the counterculture movement. But in general, it really just is a social and aesthetic movement. In the same way that you might talk about I don't even know what, like goth culture or something like that today. It grows out of stuff that we saw in the beat movement in the 1950s. It is partially political and partially sort of more social and environmental, cultural in a way. The sort of, quote unquote, sex, drugs, rock and roll, right, slogan is very associated with again, the kind of more cultural side of the counterculture. And like anything, by the end of the 1960s, it becomes kind of mainstream. If you're a teenager, you just sort of are a hippie, you're sort of dressed that way almost by default. The aesthetic generally is, well, sort of what people at the time period saw as being very kind of out there, being very loose, not conforming to the kind of more buttoned up and traditional aesthetic of the 1950s, right? If you can kind of picture those pictures that we looked at in the 1950s notes of, girls in their sort of neat little skirts and sweaters and their kind of carefully coiffed hair that you go to the beauty parlor every week to, make sure that it's set in curls. And then you take a look at these pictures here, right? You're seeing sort of emphasis on like loose flowing clothing and like long hair and almost what people at the time saw as being kind of unkempt or ill-groomed. It get called dirty hippies a lot, right, by like Richard Nixon and that ilk. And just sort of a general disregard for like, a lot of the mores or the values of 1950s society, sort of dropping out and making, sort of deeper connection with the world in a sort of a very meaningful way, something that was very important to this kind of general age. The most extreme expression of the hippie aesthetic kind of comes with what we might call commune cultures, a bunch of these communes that spring up around the country, especially in the southwest and on the west coast. And communes are basically what they sound like. They're small communities that live communally, so no like direct property ownership. Everybody shares everything, shares all the responsibilities, right? Works for the betterment of the commune itself. If you cast your mind back, like way back, all the way to the 1840s, the antebellum period, this might make you think a little bit of like utopian communities, and that's a pretty good comparison, right? These, they didn't tend to be religious or not organized religious anyway, but they were about this sort of, disconnect from society and create this kind of communal experience within society itself. The centerpiece of counterculture, though, is definitely the counterculture music. In the 1950s, we talked about the rise of rock and roll and people like Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, and lots of rock and roll songs with titles like, I Want to Hold Your Hand and, Let's Rock in the Gym, and those kinds of things are very much sort of dance, kind of young teen type aesthetics. When you listen to later counterculture music, it gets a lot more hard-edged. We hear a lot more kind of like the electric guitar sound, if you're familiar, and it also gets a lot more messagey. We have a lot more of an interest in using music to explore, what have they done to the rain, and all the colors of of the wind and all of that kind of stuff. It's a little bit more psychedelic and a little bit less straightforward, just like dance music in general, so counterculture music. Arguably, the height of the hippie aesthetic comes in Woodstock in 1969, the very famous music festival held in upstate New York, to which something like, let's say maybe 10,000 tickets were sold and like 60,000 people showed up. Those are not exact numbers, but you get the general idea. Woodstock was a major several-day expression of this kind of culture of love and this culture of the hippie aesthetic in general, and it's often held up as the height of the hippie movement. 1969 is a rough year in general for the counterculture. We have the Manson murders and a bunch of other things that kind of take a general hit in Nixon's first year of Nixon's presidency. So this is kind of the apogee of the hippie movement, as it were. It was summer of 1969 in Woodstock. By 1968, by 1969, like I said, it's become less of like, I'm a rebel and I'm dressing like a hippie, and more like I'm a normal teen, so I'm dressing like a hippie. It's become a lot more mainstream, as happens with a lot of our kind of outside fringe movements. Just like we talked about with rock and roll, starts out counterculture and then becomes kind of more mainstream culture by the time it's done. Okay, so we're going to pause there. This is about the first half of these notes in the 1960s, which are long, as you might have noticed. When we come back to these, we're going to check in on several other social movements. We'll look at what's going on in the Black community and in the Hispanic community, Native Americans, women, a couple of other groups, and then we'll finish out by getting ourselves up to Richard Nixon and to Watergate. So we'll see you soon for part 2. Thanks.